So let's continue talking about sexual arousal and response by discussing the Master and Johnson theory of arousal. So they came up with a 4-stage arousal cycle in which they described what happened during sexual activation, sexual arousal. So this chart shows 4 stages: desire, excitement, orgasm, and resolution. So stage 1 is desire, where you get psychologically interested in sex. Excitement is when the body begins to be aroused. Orgasm, I think we all know that. And then resolution is the process of the body going back to the normal stage of homeostasis. Now you might be wondering why there is a microwave here. Well, this is the male sexual response cycle, and men's sexuality is kind of like a microwave where you press all the right buttons and you press start and it starts to cook. Women, on the other hand, are more like an oven. What happens when you turn on an oven? Nothing, right? You have to preheat it in order for it to start cooking. So women's sexuality tends to be a bit more slower burning. Once it gets going, it goes as well, if not better, than the microwave. But you know, you can't just turn it on and you're cooking. You have to preheat. You have to warm it up. All right, so women's sexual response is basically the same as men's, according to the Masters and Johnson theory. So you have desire, excitement, orgasm, resolution. The orgasm stage, they do admit to the possibility of multiple orgasms, which is a thing. Women can have multiple orgasms. Men can also have multiple orgasms, although it's not as common. And then I hate this chart, which is why I include it. But for some reason, for women, orgasm is optional. Like, you can have resolution with orgasm or without orgasm. I don't know why it's only optional for women and it's not optional for men. Like, men have to have an orgasm. Okay, sometimes men don't orgasm during sex, right? And if your lady, guys, is not having an orgasm with sex, then you need to work a little harder, okay? But I'm kidding, okay. But the truth is that it's really normal for people to not have an orgasm. Like, there's nothing wrong with you if every so often you don't orgasm, okay? Sometimes it happens. Like, if you're never having an orgasm, then there's probably something wrong. Like, physically or perhaps even psychologically, there could be something going on. But to not have an orgasm once or even a few times is totally normal, okay? Totally normal. I mean, maybe you're just not feeling good that day. Maybe for a woman, you're not in that pre-ovulation window where you can get pregnant, and so your body's just not as interested in sex. You know, there's all sorts of things that could prevent you from having an orgasm. Maybe you're really stressed out. Maybe you're worried about getting pregnant or getting a girl knocked up. So there's tons of things that could prevent orgasm in men and women. All right, now let's talk about how sexual desire, sexual arousal actually happens. The Kinsey Institute has come up with a new model of how sexual arousal happens, which is much better than the Masters and Johnson one. Because if you look at the Masters and Johnson, it says you have to be psychologically interested, then you get physically interested, then arousal and resolution. But that's not really how it happens. Some people get physically interested before their brain checks in, and that's very common with women. Some people are able to even have an orgasm without their brain ever being, desiring sex. People who are raped sometimes have orgasms because it's just a physical thing that happens, but their brain is never, like, they were never turned on. It's just, orgasm is what happens during sex. Like, it's just what happens. It's a reflex. So it's much more complicated than the Masters and Johnson 4 stages of arousal. And that's really, modern science just doesn't really subscribe to this anymore. It's like, it's a good basic sort of model, but it's not really supported with how the brain works and how sexuality works. So the dual control model is really the model of sexual arousal that is being used right now. Will they come up with a better one later? Maybe. But the nice thing about the dual control model is it explains so much, way more than the Masters and Johnson 4-stage model explains. It helps you to understand why you do what you do, why you respond the way you respond. And it also incorporates a lot of modern science, physiology of the body. So anyhow, let's get into that. All right, so the dual control model says that our sexuality, our sexual response, is controlled by 2 separate things. Something we call the brake and the accelerator. The dual control model was developed in the 1990s by the Kinsey Institute by two researchers named Eric Johnson and John Bancroft, and it's so much more than the four-stage model. You know, the four-stage model says, you know, in the desire stage, lubrication begins to happen. You know, at the end of the excitement stage, ejaculation happens, and it kind of describes the physiological process. But the dual control model describes not just what happens during arousal, but like the central mechanisms of what's controlling arousal, what's controlling your behavior, what's controlling what is going on in sex. Your central nervous system is composed of two different parts, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system activates things. So if you get angry, your sympathetic nervous system has been activated. The parasympathetic nervous system calms things down. So the dual control model is recognizing the two parts of your central nervous system and that they're both contributing to arousal, which happens in every type of arousal in the body, including sexual arousal. So we call this, in the dual control model, you have the brake and the accelerator. The brake is the parasympathetic, the calming section of the central nervous system, and the accelerator is the sympathetic section of the central nervous system that speeds things up. Parasympathetic is the brake, sympathetic the accelerator. So much more than the four-stage model. You know, the four-stage model says, you know, in the desire stage, lubrication begins to happen. It consists of two parts, right? The brake, which is more properly called the sexual inhibition system. It inhibits your behavior. It stops you from wanting to have sex, which is important, right? Like you can't go to a party and just randomly try to have sex with like the host's husband or something. That would be really bad. Or you can't just like, hey, this guy has hepatitis. Cool, let's have sex, right? Hopefully there is a part of your brain that puts the brakes on and says, well, this is a bad idea. That is the sexual inhibition system. In the sympathetic nervous system with the accelerator, it's called the sexual excitation system. So it gets you more interested, makes you want to go out and have sex. If the sexual excitation system is totally in control and the inhibition system isn't working well, it's not strong, then you might be a sex addict. You're constantly having sex, you're putting yourself in bad situations, taking risks, you know, not using protection or birth control or whatever, okay? So you don't want an accelerator without a brake. That would be really bad. I mean, just think of driving a car, right? Both of them are equally important in order to have control over your life. But you also do want to be able to accelerate. You want to be able to be sexually excited, or sex just, you're not interested in sex. It isn't exciting to you. It isn't something you want to do. The sexual excitation system, or the accelerator, is constantly working. It's constantly scanning your environment for things that are sexually relevant. In other words, they're stimuli in life that turn you on sexually. So, you know, a really good looking man or a woman, a person in skimpy clothes, maybe for you, high heels turn you on, or a really expensive car turns you on. There's certain things that turn you on that are sexually relevant stimuli, and they may not turn on somebody else. It might be just something that, you know, that's your thing. So the sexual excitation system is constantly looking for information, touch, smell, things you see, things you hear, to say, okay, that's important sexually, and send it to the brain and say, okay, turn the body on, sexually arouse the body. The sexual inhibition system, this does not mean shyness. This is just, it's literally doing the same exact thing as the accelerator, but the brake is scanning the environment for things that are dangerous, things that say don't have sex, things that are turn-offs, that whatever it is that put the brakes onto your sexual arousal. So somebody who smells bad, somebody who might be a higher risk of having a sexually transmitted disease, maybe fear of an unwanted pregnancy. You know, so what are the threats in the environment, the sexual threats, the things that say this is a really bad idea? Or even an environment where it's inappropriate to get aroused in, or somebody that it would be inappropriate to be aroused, even if it's a perfectly safe person. He's married. I mean, he's married to your sister or whatever, you know, that person should not turn you on. So, or hopefully doesn't. So if your inhibition system, if your brakes are strong enough, if they're working appropriately, then that part of the brain will say, don't create arousal. Brain, please listen to me. Don't get aroused in this situation. The power of the dual control model is in its ability to explain sexual functioning or sexual dysfunctioning. So if there's a problem with your sexuality, is it that the accelerator is not stimulated enough, or maybe overstimulated, or is it that the brakes aren't getting the right stimulation? And in most cases, we think that it's the accelerator, that we're not turned on enough, we're not sexual. You know, if a woman doesn't want to have sex, she's frigid. And we don't even have a term for men for that, right? Because we just assume their accelerator always works. And so we think if there's a problem with sex, that it's because you're just not interested enough in sex. Your accelerator isn't working. But in most cases, the brake is actually working too hard. The brake is turned on, the brake is pressed down, and it's saying, stop, don't get interested in sex. And so a lot of people are very interested in sex, they want to have sex, but the brake is pushed down so hard that they can't move the car forward, they can't get any acceleration. And once you know whether it's a problem with the accelerator or the brake, now you know how to fix it. And that's something the 4-stage model of arousal that Masters and Johnson came up with did not provide at all. There's simply an understanding of the physiology of sex, but there's no understanding of the psychology or the dysfunction, or how to fix the dysfunction of sexuality. Your level of sexual arousal at any given moment is a combination of how firmly pressed down your accelerator is, your gas pedal is, and how pressed down your brake is, right? Because driving your car, you could press the gas pedal and the brake at the same time, okay? Or they could be halfway, or one could be all the way and one could be not at all. So what is the combination of the accelerator and the brakes? How are they being pressed in your sexuality? So it's also a product of how sensitive your accelerator and brakes are. You drive some cars, like my sister had a 1964 and a half Ford Mustang, and that was the car that I learned how to drive in when I got my driver's license. Now, this car, like sometimes you had to stand on the brakes to get the brake to go down, which was really bad, like in an emergency situation. The accelerator was great, right? You push the accelerator and that muscle car moved. But the brakes just were not very sensitive, okay? And so sexuality can be the same way. Sometimes the accelerator, like, you're off and running. And that was kind of the joke about the microwave with men. Men tend to have a more sensitive accelerator. Women tend to have a more sensitive brake. So they put the brakes on really easily. And many times, it's not that a woman isn't interested in sex, but it's more all the reasons not to have sex that are stopping her from actually having that interest, arousal, orgasm, whatever it is that's going on with sexuality. So SIS, the sexual inhibition system, and SES, the excitation system, these are traits. We all have them. They're more or less stable over the lifespan. But they also vary from individual to individual. Like in personality, you have extroverts and introverts. Some people are extroverted, some are introverted. So your brake and accelerator are like personality traits, although they are physiological. That's how sensitive is your nervous system, is really what it's saying, or that section of your nervous system. We all have different sensitivities, which all lead to different arousability, different interest in sex, different levels of sexual activity, and so on. Some people are high on both, some people are low on both, some people are have a high brake system, some people have a high acceleration system and low opposites. So most of us are average, most of us are in the middle. We've got, moderate acceleration, moderate brakes. There's a few people on the extremes, most people are just in that happy medium. Okay, so let's take a look at what would happen if your brake or accelerator is especially sensitive. So let's say you're high on the accelerator and you're low on the brakes. Okay, so sensitive accelerator, hardly any brakes at all. What kind of sexual response are you going to have? Well, you're going to respond really easily to sexual stimuli. You see a pretty girl and you're turned on immediately. You want to have sex with her. And for most people with sensitive brakes, there would be a lot of reasons to not pursue sex with this stranger, even though she's sexy. But you have weak brakes, right? So you're easily aroused and you have a difficult time preventing arousal, okay? Which is not all it's cracked up to be, right? Like maybe you're in church, maybe you are standing up at the chalkboard in school and, in front of your class and you see a pretty girl and you get, an erection in front of everybody. So it's nice to have a balance of the two. A sensitive accelerator and not so sensitive brakes describes about 2 to 6% of women. Okay? So some women are really easily aroused and have a hard time stopping their arousal, okay, even when it's inappropriate. So it's rare that people have that. Men, it's a higher percentage are like that, but it's not much higher. It's associated with like sexual risk taking, compulsivity, sexual addiction. So it's not really a great situation to have. Okay, the brain does not notice any threatening stimuli. It doesn't pay attention to the reasons to not have sex. A lot of these people feel out of control. They especially when they're stressed, and they're more likely to have multiple partners, to use less protection, and just generally feel out of control. Let's say you have the opposite combination. So you have an insensitive accelerator and you have very sensitive brakes. So this is about 1 to 4% of women where they have a lot of difficulty in getting aroused. There's a lack of sexual interest, lack of desire, have problems with orgasms. So with sensitive brakes, you're very sensitive to all the reasons, all the threats to your life or to your livelihood of why you shouldn't be having sex. You know, the possibility of getting pregnant or whatever. You're very hypersensitive to those things. And because you have an insensitive accelerator, it doesn't work very well. It takes a lot of effort to get aroused. You really have to concentrate. You really have to have a lot of foreplay. You have to have, hopefully you have a spouse that's really good at maybe doing things throughout the day to kind of prepare you to be interested in sex. But you don't just get interested in sex at the drop of a hat. It takes you a while, and you have to be really conscious in order to get sexually aroused. You would think that a sensitive accelerator would be the biggest cause of problems, but it's actually the sensitive brake that is the biggest cause of sexual dysfunction. In a 2008 survey of 226 women aged 18 to 81, low interest in sex, arousal difficulties, and orgasm difficulty were significantly correlated with inhibition factors, or the brake, especially arousal contingency. Basically, unless things are just right, I can't get interested in sex. Okay. For men, a more sensitive accelerator is the #1 problem for most sexual dysfunction, but for women, a sensitive brake is the biggest problem. So it's weird because we think that women just don't have interest in sex, but that's not what this is saying. It's saying women are interested in sex, but they just can't allow themselves to get aroused because that brake is so firmly pressed. So I have a sexual temperament questionnaire that I will post on the website, and you can take that and see, you know, how strong is your brake versus your accelerator, and kind of see where you are. Chances are that you will be medium inhibition, medium excitation, or medium brake, medium accelerator. That's what most people are, right in the middle. So like a risky partner, a risky situation will increase your anxiety, but you do get fairly easily aroused, and so on. Okay. So that's the most normal, but I also wouldn't say it's abnormal, because like 6% of women having a strong accelerator and a weak brake is like, that's not just a handful of women. That's millions and millions of women around the world, you know, so. All right, so is this different for men and women? The answer is yes, but not necessarily. Okay, in some situations. So if you had to guess whether men or women had a stronger or more sensitive accelerator, you'd guess men, right? The truth is that yes, on average, men do have a more sensitive accelerator than men. And if you had to guess which had the more sensitive brakes, you'd guess women, and that's true. Women on average do tend to have more sensitive brakes. However, within men as a group, there are lots of men who have an insensitive accelerator, and within women, there's many women who have an insensitive brake. So just because you are a woman or you're a man does not mean that you fall into that stereotype. It is more normal, but it's not unusual to not be normal. More important than the difference between simply like the sensitivity of the accelerator of men and women is the relationship between the brake and the accelerator and the psychology that is going on with that specific man or woman. That is a much stronger predictor of what's going to happen with their sexuality. For example, about 10 to 20% of both men and women report an increase in their sexual interest when they're anxious or depressed. Okay, so you get stressed out, 10 to 20% get more sexually interested. And that's both men and women. But a guy who wants sex more when he's anxious or depressed probably also has less sensitive brakes. Okay. So in contrast, a woman who wants sex more when she's anxious or depressed is likely to have a more sensitive accelerator. Okay, so the stress is causing them to want sex more, but for men, it's more likely that when they want that sex, when they want stress sex, their brakes don't work as well. And the women who want stress sex, their accelerator is more sensitive. Okay, so just an interesting male-female difference. So this shows us that it's more than just like a population level difference in the average sensitivities between men and women, but it's more that there's a difference in how the two systems relate to the other motivational systems in the brain, particularly the stress response. So just remember, the goal is not what are men like and what are women like, but it's what are you like, and what are the people, if you ever work in a field like sex therapy, or you have a problem in your relationship, what are you and your spouse like as individuals? Who cares what men are like and women are like, but what is the individual like? What is going on with that person, with their brake, their accelerator, and their psychology? So the interesting thing is, no one was born responding to all the sexual stimuli out there. Like, you don't naturally get turned on by high heels or a woman holding a whip or something. Like, it's not built into our genetics to be turned on by that, to be turned on by like the idea of having sex in an elevator or something like that. So we are trained, we are conditioned. You remember operant conditioning, or classical conditioning. Well, it could be operant conditioning too, to classify certain things as sexual and certain things as not sexual, which is why people can get kind of screwed up about what turns them on sexually. It depends on how your brain was trained to notice what is sexually relevant stimuli. The brain notices sexually relevant stimuli, and it also notices threats or potential threats, and it sends signals to the brain to say, get aroused or don't get aroused. And the brain can be sending both signals simultaneously, right? To turn on and turn off at the same time. But that doesn't really tell us how our brain figures out what is sexually relevant stimuli or what is a potential threat. So the process of learning what's sexually relevant is like when you learn a language as a kid, or you learn what colors are. You're having this conditioning going on where we have this like innate capacity to learn. We are genetically programmed to learn certain things, but then the information has to be plugged in to say, this is what you're learning. This is sexual, this is not sexual. So you kind of learn this sexual language of what turns you on, what turns you off. A lot of it's culturally based. There's in China, back when they used to do foot binding. If you don't know what that is, look it up, but be prepared for not pretty pictures. So basically, you break a little girl's foot and then you curl her toes under so that she had this just little tiny foot. Smaller the foot, the more sexy it is. And the real cool thing is to be able to fit a foot in your mouth. That's a big sexual turn on. Okay, I think that's gross. You probably think that's gross because we're not Chinese from that time period in history. Okay, so a lot of these things it's the cultural sexual language that we are taught. So there's this cool rat study that was done. And so imagine you're a male rat and your mother's raising you in a healthy environment. You have everything you need, everything is normal. But in addition to everything being normal, the researcher trains you that the smell of lemons is a sexual turn on. And ordinarily, like, a rat would not associate the smell of lemons with being turned on sexually, just like a human wouldn't associate that. But if a researcher puts a receptive female, so like a female rat that's in heat, and he puts lemon, like essential oil, on the rat, and then if this is the first time the male rat's had sex, he has sex with her. The next time the researcher puts a female rat smelling like lemons in, the rat will immediately want to mate with her. Now, the weird thing is, if he puts a female rat in that doesn't smell like lemons, he's actually a little bit turned off. It's much slower to approach her, much slower to eventually have sex. And with the rat, 80% of the ejaculations were with the lemony partner, and only 20% were with the rat that did not smell like lemons. Okay, so that's a big difference because this rat was trained that for the accelerator to respond to the smell of lemons. Okay, and this is not something that we would naturally, a rat or a human would naturally respond to, but you can be trained that this is a turn on.